Welcome everybody to today's seminar. My name's Andrew Smith. I'm based in the Department of Plant Sciences and I help coordinate the bioenergy theme in the Oxford Energy Network. And we're very pleased today to welcome for the next seminar in this term series, Professor Patricia Thornley from Aston University. I'm sure many of you will know of her activities already. She's director of the Energy and Bioproducts Research Institute at Aston University, and is also Associate Dean for Research there at the moment. She tells me she's heavily involved in this ref submission at the moment. She's also Editor-in-Chief of the Elsevier journal, Biomass and Bioenergy, which is one of the leading journals in this field. And perhaps most pertinently for today's seminar, Patricia is probably known to many of you as Director of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, is the UK's leading forum in this space that's funded by EPSRC and PSRC. And the role of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub is to develop a sustainable bioenergy system for UK's transition to low carbon energy future. So we'll look forward very much to Patricia's talk today to talk to us about biomass and bioenergy, perhaps particularly in the light, as some of you may have heard in our pre-meeting chat, in the context of some of the spectacular advances that have been recently in the rolling out and further development of offshore wind and solar. And it'll be very interesting to hear a bit more of the detail about what role biomass and bioenergy can play both in the UK's and the planet's carbon budgets in the future. So welcome, Patricia, to today's seminar. And I'll hand over the forum to you now.
Okay, thank you for that, Andrew. Can you all hear me okay? I hope.
Yes, well, I can, so
brilliant.
All good.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, biomass and bioenergy, is it really a vital component of the UK's green economy? My opening slide here shows you the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, which has already been mentioned, so I will move on. This is, the UK annually produces a set of statistics around its energy. This is the 2020 copy of the Digest UK Energy Statistics. And within that, you can see just what a vital component bioenergy is. The dark green on the bottom is the bioelectricity component of the UK's renewable energy. The light green above that is other renewable electricity. So that's the PV and the wind and the other things that got mentioned earlier. We then have the red bit, that's biomass for heating, and then other renewable heating. So things like geothermal and stuff like that are in the pink above it. And when you look at biotransport, despite all that we've done in terms of electric vehicles, the reality is that biofuels administered via an obligation from Department for Transport is essentially the only game in town here. What you see from this is that when we look on an energy basis, not a capacity basis, that bio is absolutely key to everything that the UK has delivered so far in terms of our renewable energy commitments. And there's lots more to go. So this is some work which was done by Andrew Welfel when he was my PhD student up in Manchester. And what you see here is modelling of different forms of bioenergy. I draw your attention to the key on the right, where you can see that actually an awful lot of the projections here around bioenergy are focused on wastes, household waste, food and organic waste, sewage material, and then another significant proportion around agricultural residues, animal waste, forestry residues. Not a lot of this comes from dedicated biomass crops, and not a lot of it comes from the forestry that we perhaps automatically think of. So I think broadening our perspective on what bio is and realising that it includes all these other things as well, these resources that we have at our disposal, makes quite a big difference. Now, what Andrew was doing was he was doing some modelling of what the UK would look like if we had a food focus, if we decided we wanted to increase our self-sufficiency in food, if we decided that we were going to work on improving biodiversity on land, and no matter which option he took around how we use our land in the UK, what you saw was a very dramatic increase in the amount of bioenergy. So he did this in 2015. And the increase that you can see through to 2020 has probably just about been borne out. But as you can see, for most of the options here, there is at least scope to sustainably double what we're doing in bio at the moment, and that is without going near anything in terms of imports from overseas. So really important to remember that there is a huge potential, but it may not look like what you conventionally think of as bio. Okay. And of course, that was derived from a model. Models are incredibly influential. Government departments love them, and they use them a lot to make projections. And this is actually taken from some work that was commissioned by Department for Transport last year, where they asked us as Supergen to have a look at what the role of modelling is in bioenergy, and sort of start to unpick why it is that despite this big potential, it's not coming through in various systems to the extent that you would expect. Now, I'm conscious that I'm sure I've got some people in the audience who are big fans of integrated assessment models, and those are often the things that drive the attention of policymakers. Models that tell us, you know, for the certain land use, energy demand, CO2 emissions, what the future can look like. And the way we looked at this was that within bio, we actually have a need for a number of specialist models, which you can see on the far left. And those are things that look at nerdy stuff, the amount of carbon in soil at different depths, the biodiversity that we end up with, the growth and the ratio of residues to product in different food systems, the impact of management on forestry. There's an awful lot of specialism going on in that sort of land-based focus up on the top left. There's also a myriad of different ways of using bioenergy and converting it. So you have all these masses of different chemical process models as well. And those chemical models tend to feed into the set in the middle, the energy system models. And what we found when we looked at this was that there's lots of specialist models. The decision making is done by the integrated assessment models, and the problem is the link in between. That actually, if those energy system models aren't accurately picking up some of the nuances around things like, well, this specialist model gave us this prediction of resource availability, but it was making gross assumptions about the food patterns or the dietary preferences of the population. And without understanding all of that in depth, you can end up feeding the integrated assessment models with the wrong data. And as many of you know, once you start feeding models with wrong data, you cannot predict what's going to happen next. So this is some work that we did last year, and this is being picked up as part of the biomass strategy, which is being led by BEIS at the moment. So what I wanted to focus on today really was that gives you a flavour of the fact that bio is significant in the UK. Bio can be more significant. We've got some challenges around how the energy elements of bio are viewed and picked up. But actually, there are other challenges. And one of the biggest ones is that an awful lot of the population don't really get how cutting down trees is a good idea. I'm putting it really simplistically. So I did just want to talk us through this, and I highly recommend this resource. You see the web link for it in the bottom left. This is some work that we did a few years ago with, I think, 10 different universities around the UK, and we worked with some fine artists to produce a comic book, mostly at teenagers and young professionals, that explains what bio is and what the issues are. It also does a pretty good introduction to climate change generally. I've got hard copies. If anybody wants them, I can get them posted out to you, but it's also available online. And essentially, trees sequester carbon while they're growing. And therefore, if you're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while the tree grows, the theory runs that if you then combust or use in some way that timber which you have produced, then you're returning CO2 to atmosphere, sure, but it's CO2 that has only been taken from the atmosphere relatively recently. Now, the extreme example of this would be if we think of straw, where actually the wheat has grown in the last year. So if we took the CO2 out last year and we put it back this year, it doesn't really make a big difference to the long-term atmospheric burden. Okay, so when we use bio, we are returning CO2 to atmosphere in some of the applications. We don't have to, but in some of them we are. So the importance of the cycle then comes up, and I will pick up on this later when I talk about carbon debt. The second thing that's important is that you have to realise that for most of these forests, trees and biomass sources that we're using, the supply chain emissions are usually low. Unless we're looking at a food crop, at something like soya or palm or rapeseed oil, what you generally find is this is pretty low input stuff. We don't put much fertilizer on it. We don't do much ground prep. And therefore, the supply chain stuff is really low. Another important thing to realise about trees is that the growth and the carbon uptake are fastest in the earliest stages of the life cycle. So the carbon that a tree absorbs from atmosphere actually gradually plateaus out, so that by the time it's at its full maturity, it's barely extracting anything anymore. And at that point in time, the plan for plantation forests is normally to get the saw log, the timber, which is very high value, and to use that for something useful, building houses, that sort of thing. In order to get that really tall, straight tree, what you have to do is you have to thin. You have to make sure that the trees have enough light. You have to make sure they're not being lent on by other ones nearby. And that produces material on pretty much a yearly basis that has no real positive use other than the sort that we would put it to in a bioenergy system. And the final point worth knowing about trees is that they use land. Now, most landowners want a return for their money. And if they haven't sold their land to a property developer in order to make millions off it because it happens to be in the right part of the country, then they want another form of income. And so I think we need to think really practically here that if we're expecting landowners to cover their land with trees, to maintain that, to sequester carbon and to grow that biodiversity and carbon, and we're not going to pay them for it, then we have a serious problem with the economics of land use and with the need to provide a social return to the owner. So trees use land and we've got to be able to provide a return for that. And generally that's via the saw log in the middle, and the smaller parts of the tree are actually worth relatively little. So if I want to take all that I said in that previous slide and I want to use that system, the tree, and I want to use that to provide carbon reductions, there are a few things I have to make sure happens. I have to make sure that my growth is sustainable, i.e. that it's pretty low input in terms of fertilizers, that I haven't created this through some form of land use change which is going to leak carbon, and therefore that it's removing atmospheric carbon dioxide. I have to make sure my supply chain emissions are low. And ideally, what I want to do is displace some fossil fuel, which is causing lots of carbon emissions, and this one will be lower, and therefore we get a good saving. That's just sort of common sense. Now, let's take those one by one. Are the trees that we're using in bioenergy low input? This is some work that we did a good 10 years ago now. And what I want you to focus on here is the set of 6 bars on the left-hand side with the heading GWP. So that is the global warming potential of trees growing 6 different ways. We've got a natural gas reference, first of all, in the first column, and then we have actually 5 different ways of growing the trees with no fertilizer on them, with an inorganic fertilizer, and with different levels of sewage sludge. What you see for the global warming potential is that all those ways of growing trees actually give you a massive reduction in global warming potential compared to gas. It doesn't really matter what you do with them. Trees are not particularly demanding. As I said earlier, this would be different if we were looking at oilseed rape or soya, but for trees, they're pretty okay. Now, there might be a few other things you get worried about if you start putting sewage sludge around some of these crops in terms of eutrophication and acidification. I'll come back to that later. But we've got to make sure that the wood is low input, and for most cases that are economically viable in the UK, it is. We've got to make sure we didn't have land use change. This is a very hot topic in parts of the world where we are fairly constrained and where there may be pressure on land. The most common issues here are around Malaysia and Indonesia with palm, and I would argue also in South America with some soy farms. This is work that I did a good 10 years ago now, where we looked at the greenhouse gas savings that you got by producing oil from soya, from palm oil, from UK rapeseed, and from used cooking oil. And then we looked at what difference land use change made. And I'll ask you to focus on the columns on the right-hand side. So payback time in years, column A, that is if we have an existing cropland, so we've got something that is already an agricultural farmland, and we convert it to growing whatever we've said there, soy, palm, rape, whatever. And the payback time is immediate for those, that they immediately incur savings. But if you have a situation in column B where you had a forest previously and you've converted your forest into instead produce soy, palm, rape, etc., then the payback periods become huge, 5,000 years. That's frankly not helpful when we're looking at issues of climate change. And the same is true with sea. Even for some grasslands in some parts of the world, less the case in the UK and the Northern Hemisphere, but very, very important in regions like South America and Pampas grasslands, where you can still be looking at paybacks of 1,500 years. So we've got to be really careful about land use change. But land use change cuts both ways. So if you've already got a food crop and you're turning that into a crop that you're using for energy instead, then the environmental impacts are not that different, frankly. If you are converting it to something like miscanthus or willow or the other crops that we use for bio, you're generally actually being positive in terms of environmental impact compared to that land being used for, say, producing wheat in the UK. And if you go to a mixed agroforestry system, so a mixture of energy and food crops where the two sit side by side, you actually can make quite a big positive difference at the bottom there. All these images, by the way, are from the very nice comic, so do go and look at it if you have time afterwards. And then we get on to other issues, and this is one of the things Andrew and I were discussing before we started. If you start with marginal land that's been abandoned or degraded or is contaminated in some way, you can actually have really big positives by planting with bioenergy crops. One of the demons here is around the concept of indirect land use change. Now, this was raised by an American called Tim Searchinger, probably close on 10 years ago now. And Tim pointed out that while it's all very well to look at the direct land use change and quantify the carbon emissions associated with that, we had to realise that if we now weren't growing wheat there, we were probably growing to grow wheat somewhere else. And worse than that, if somewhere else wasn't as fertile and didn't give us the same yield, then we could end up with an indirect effect, which also cost us carbon. This is picked up massively in many of the modelling tools that I referred to earlier, the integrated assessment models. And I think that the idea has been around for long enough now that what we're starting to see come through is lots of local case studies. I've seen several come through in the US and South America in recent years that say, we predicted that if we made this change and we took this food crop and we switched to bio, that what would happen is we'd get an ILUC effect and that we would get indirect land use change of this quantity, but it didn't happen. We've done it for real. And what actually happened was the farmer only had a certain amount of land and he still wanted to grow that. So he intensified or he did something else or the demand changed. It's a complex system and I don't think we have anywhere near enough evidence on it, but I'm a great fan of not trusting models unless I can see them validated. And I would say that the jury is distinctly still out on this issue of indirect land use change. And I'm prepared to discuss that afterwards with anyone particularly interested in that topic. But let's look at getting beyond the land and the production, the supply chain emissions. So this was some work done with colleagues on life cycle assessment, and this is for wood. This is wood for pellet production in the US, which is then shipped to the UK and used in a power station. So this is something a bit like Drax Power Station, largest power station in the UK. Complete conversion of one unit to biomass and takes several million tons of pellets every year across the Atlantic from North American forests. What you can see here is, let's concentrate with the two bars on the left, the forest residues, and I've given two options. One is drying the wood with biomass and the other is drying with diesel. Biomass is cheaper. So let's look at the drying with biomass figures. And what you can see is that there's a certain amount of carbon emissions associated with the production. The processing, so that's the drying and grinding in the machinery to produce the pellets, has a bit more. Transporting it across the Atlantic Ocean is actually incredibly energy efficient. And despite what you might intuitively think, does not significantly add to the carbon burden of the pellets when they arrive here. If you switch your drying with biomass to drying with diesel, you have a much bigger impact on the carbon efficiency of this system than anything you could possibly dream of doing in terms of that transatlantic transport. So the supply chain emissions are important, but we've got to focus on the right things. So you want to be drying with biomass, you want to be keeping the fertilizer inputs low, and as we said previously, avoiding the land use change. The next thing you can do to maximize the carbon benefits of these systems is to actually focus on things which are carbon intensive. So one of the challenges that we have in the UK is that a lot of the country actually has relatively efficient heating provided by low carbon natural gas when we enjoyed low cost North Sea gas for many, many years. And therefore, our heating actually has quite a low carbon footprint compared to what it did 30 years ago, or to what heating did, let's say, when I grew up in Northern Ireland, where there wasn't a natural gas supply. So what that means is that if you want to use biomass to provide heat, it's quite hard to get a big carbon saving, because the gas-fired efficient boilers that we have, condensing boilers, are actually pretty good already. If you want to use biomass, it's much better to apply it in the electricity sector, where you can get much bigger carbon savings based on, this is a bit out of date, I will admit, based on the carbon intensity of the national grid, at least as it was a few years ago. Okay, now I said I would return to the vexed issue of carbon debt. Carbon debt is about the notion that because you have a tree that has taken carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere and you then cut it down, that you in some way, shape or form are then changing the carbon dynamics of what goes on, and you've incurred a debt that you have to repay because you've taken that tree out of the ecosystem and you've used it. Now, what I've shown you here is some very detailed work on the forestry systems that we did with a Canadian and a Spanish institute and about 2-3 years ago now. And what we've done is we've looked at 3 different types of forest, unsurprisingly, ones that are common in the UK, Spain and Canada. And they have different rotations. So a rotation is how long it takes a tree to grow to full maturity. What you see down on the bottom is the longest rotation, 70 years to get your tree to full maturity. And then we have quite a fast one in the middle. And then we have the intermediate one up at the top. For each of these systems, we looked at the carbon that was in the atmosphere, the carbon that was in the soil, the carbon that was in the tree, and then the carbon as it moved into each of those harvested products. And we tracked the total carbon stock over these extended periods of time. And you see, I could take any little section of this graph and I could look at any one of those sort of cliff edges that you see. I wish I had a laser pointer at this point, but you can see there are very sharp descents. And if I were to show you that bit in isolation, I could argue to you that there was a big carbon debt and that we needed to repay it. But that's not reality. That's looking at only part of the picture. If we look long term, and climate change is a long-term problem, then what you actually see is that as long as you keep the same area of land planted, and as long as you keep replacing it and planting new trees, the average carbon stock does not change. It stays roughly the same. It's the average halfway up each of those axes on the y-axis side. So what this tells us is that you've got to take a long-term view with these things. And arguably, we have a problem with carbon debt because we've left this problem too late. So if I have a problem that I'm trying to solve in 20 years, then no, I shouldn't be using trees with 70-year rotations. But we have to actually maintain those trees. You know, we do need them in order to maintain the carbon stock, and therefore we need a market for them. And I come back to what I said earlier, that you have to chop them down in order to get the value from the timber, which hopefully you then use in the ecosphere itself for construction or whatever, and that is retained, not put out into the atmosphere. What's put out into the atmosphere is a relatively small proportion of the tree. Okay, so carbon debt is, I believe, an optical illusion that depends on when you choose to start and finish your analysis. Allocating carbon emissions is in some ways a similar concept, and this is about the fact that if you have a tree and you say, well, we've taken lots of carbon in, we've got it all locked up now, what are we going to do with it? I've told you several times that the best thing you can do with it is to use it for construction. And, you know, this is why many of the world's plantation forests started. They started because we wanted to build ships for our navy, because we wanted to build railroads in South America, those sort of things. So it always makes sense to use the main saw log, which is the highest value part of the tree, for those high value carbon sequestering applications. It's the little bits around the edge that don't have a value that might otherwise be left on the forest floor that we want to use for bioenergy. Now, this gives me a bit of a problem, because if I'm building a house with my timber, no one cares how much carbon I sequestered or how much carbon I used in the construction of the house. They care once they're in the house and they want to know what their weekly fuel bills are, but they don't care about the building. And so I've got to take my tree and I've got to say, okay, so that tree took a certain amount of carbon from the atmosphere, but how do I divide that carbon up between the bits that get used for paper, the bits that get used for timber, and the bits that get used for furniture, and the bits that get used for the bio? And there are different games that people play with this around allocating according to energy content, according to mass, and according to value. And you can get very different answers to the question of how carbon intensity is bioenergy, depending on what allocation procedures and protocols we have actually followed. So that can make a huge difference to the end figures that we get. Now, I've given a fair amount of detail on carbon because it's really important, but sustainability is an awful lot more than carbon. I want to talk briefly about this graph on the left. This has to be my all-time favorite graph. And this is actually a representation of a soy production system that is producing biodiesel in Argentina. What you can see is a sort of bluey coloured circle. That is mineral diesel, fossil fuel oil. And what I've done is I've taken an environmental risk approach and I have weighted what the probability is of a particular risk occurring against what the impact is if it happens. Okay, so I've compounded the two together. And I have looked here at a total of 36 different environmental impacts that my energy system might have. They contain a combination of environmental, economic, and social parameters. And within that, I've weighted all of them. And I've used a reference case of the mineral diesel in the middle. If I'm going to make this really simple, there's a reference on the bottom you can follow up if you want to, but to make it simple, if I make this system more sustainable, then I stretch that circle and make it bigger. And what you can see is there's a good half dozen points around the circle where it has indeed got bigger. And I have done a good thing, and I have made this more sustainable by, instead of having in my car oil from the Middle East, and instead I've got biodiesel from soy production in Argentina. But then there's a whole lot of other things that have become worse. And this is essential to think about, these trade-offs around different environmental, social and economic impacts. And I've put on the right to remind us the Sustainable Development Goals and the diversity of those. And climate only actually gets mentioned in one of them. So yes, we have affordable energy up above, but the climate thing is important, but it's only one aspect of sustainability. I'll give you a few examples now of projects in different parts of the world that I hope will show this a bit more clearly. Another PhD student who graduated last year was focusing on coffee production in Colombia. And she has looked here at a number of different environmental impacts: climate change, particulates, fossil fuel depletion, photochemical oxidation, human toxicity, terrestrial ecotoxicity, freshwater ecotoxicity, a whole load of stuff along the top there that you can measure. And what we've done down the left is we've looked at different ways of producing bioenergy and different ways of using it. And within that, sorry, the biomass that she was using is the residues that occur naturally from pruning of the coffee trees. Okay, so these are wastes that occur in the plantations. And when we go through the full life cycle and take everything into account, you can see that some options, like option A1 on there, are really good. Lots of things are green, and you can see you have really positive impacts. Others are more checkered. So I think it's really important that we don't jump to conclusions and we don't focus on one parameter. By focusing on one parameter, you might make bad decisions with respect to others. And it's important to look at the full range of options and their impacts. This is a project very dear to my heart. I've been out to the Philippines a number of times in recent years because this is our pilot plant. This is my biogas pilot facility. We are working with rice straw from local communities in the Philippines who otherwise would be burning their straw because they are smallholder farmers. And in order to get another crop in and to get 2 or 3 crops in quick succession, they want to burn the straw in order to make the land accessible for more planting. That has horrendous impacts in terms of air pollution. I'm sure many of you saw the fuss that there was last year in India around this. And so we've been working with them to get innovative ways of collecting that straw and returning benefits to the community. And I could go off at a total tangent here. It's very tempting, but I won't. And talk about, you know, some of the wider socioeconomic benefits of this. But let's stick to the script. Basically, we were out there funded by the Department for International Development to look at the technical solutions for handling this straw and to develop viable business models for this. And we did save carbon. I can show you here that if they burned the straw, there's the carbon intensity. If they incorporated it in the soil, you can see the intensity. And if they use the biogas. So yes, it's coming down. We saved carbon. But that wasn't actually our objective. Our objective here was around delivering energy access to rural households in impoverished conditions and to developing business models that they could then use for productive uses that would support their economic diversification. And what I'm just going to show you here is that I showed you previously the 3 things and it was clear which one gave the best carbon impacts. Once I start looking at these wider socioeconomic impacts about health and energy access, the picture is much less clear. And we've got to be really careful and take a really nuanced view of the local context in order to make the right decisions here. The final example I have for you is we've moved to Africa now. This is sugarcane. I worked a number of years ago with the national sugar producer in South Africa. We looked at what they might do. They have a mixture of very large plantations, which they own themselves, and smaller plantations where they buy from smallholders. And many of you who are familiar with the political history of South Africa will know that some of those will also have been devolved down through land reassignment in recent years and be in different hands with people with differing levels of experience around what to do with their sugarcane. So a whole mix of things going on here. But essentially, they're all growing sugarcane. They're all harvesting it, taking it to the mill, processing it, and producing 3 fractions. The bit I'm interested in is the bit in the bottom, the bagasse. So that's the really hard to deal with, crusty stuff you're left with at the end. And we looked at a number of different pathways. And the key thing I want to highlight here is the scale. So we looked at different pathways at different scales for taking the bagasse and turning it into energy. Because those are different scales, what you do with the energy will change. For some of them, we were pumping irrigation water. For others, it was community supply. And for others, you actually ended up with electricity that you could export. And I've got a similar graph of this semi-quantitative integrated assessment where we look at the different pathways. And you can see that depending on the pathway you choose, you may end up with better or worse environmental impacts, but you're also changing the social and the economic at the same time. Okay. So being able to measure these things is important, but understanding them and understanding the trade-offs is more important. And what we've developed in Supergen is a sustainability assessment framework. I think we have something like 100 different parameters we look at, and they're divided into these 4 categories. They're about people, development, natural systems, and climate change. And the logic is the same as I described earlier, this risk assessment methodology. And we can integrate the views of stakeholders into the weighting that we have in this. And the result is that allows us to measure a number of different parameters for sustainability of different bioenergy systems. But where does the threshold lie? How can any one of us say that one system with a splodge that looks like the one on this slide here is more sustainable than one that has a different shape? It depends on your priorities. It depends on the context in which the material's growing. I suspect it often depends on whether it's you personally who are being affected by this. So I often tell students that sustainability is not black or white. You cannot possibly look at a system and say it is sustainable and that another one isn't. It is nothing but shades of grey. And frankly, I often find in policy contexts that arbitrary thresholds around this are more than unhelpful, because it encourages people to dive to the lowest common denominator at which they will still manage to get that government policy incentive or that extra payment for looking green. So that's where I'm going to leave you with something to think about. I hope that wasn't too long. I'm sorry, it's very difficult when you're presenting to still see the time.
Thank you, Patricia. That was wonderful. You covered a very large amount of ground there and touched on several things that I think might be pursued a bit further in the discussion. But it was a wonderful overview of the topic and some really salient case studies and examples there. I think you showed in the last few slides. A number of questions are coming in, and I just thought, looking at the conversation chat, and people are encouraged to send in more if they like. One place we might begin, perhaps, just is with reference back to your initial thoughts about forestry and products derived from trees. One question that of course always comes up concerns the long life cycle of trees, and one of the first questions that came in was asking whether the scale of the impacts that might be expected on a timescale of a few years is going to make a meaningful impact on our sort of carbon targets and our net zero targets for 2050 or 2060.
Yeah. The answer to the question about growing a tree that needs 75 years to grow is too slow is, of course, it's too slow, yes. If you start to plant that now, that won't make a difference to our 2050 target. However, if you have expanded the land area on the planet that is absorbing CO2, then you have made a long-term difference to the carbon stock, as long as you can maintain that. And this is when the economic viability argument becomes important, because I don't buy the argument that things are sustainable that aren't actually being valued in our capitalist society, whereby economics is everything. But I do want to pick up a little bit more on this. I showed 3 rotations of tree. The ones that are of most interest to most people working in this area are the fast growing species. And the UK government actually has just put out a new competition that I helped them scope around crops for bioenergy, which are really fast growing trees. And what we do is we're returning to the practices that we had really in the Victorian times around coppicing, where you let the tree grow for a year, then you cut it down to the stool. And then you cut again every 2 to 3 years. And we used to do this a lot with hazel and willow and things like that. The top contender at the moment is willow. There's no doubt about that in the UK. And those are on a 3-year cycle. And the idea is that you continue to cut every 3 years until you get to about 20 years. And that can make a difference. And you can, neatly quantify that within the 2050 timescale. And then one from you, Andrew, on how fast is the role of timber in construction increasing? Not fast enough, really simple. Been a lot of focus here on making it more sustainable. The PEFC and other guidelines that government have put out, and using its own procurement practices. But unless you have an economic boom where the construction industry really takes off, or big projects that use it, you won't see a significant increase in that.
Yeah. I thought that topic was just interesting because there's so much discussion in the news about the moment, with the realization of what the carbon burden is of the concrete industry and steel for reinforcing buildings and that. And even around Oxford, actually, you see a lot more buildings now going up with with a lot of timber in them. And
absolutely, yeah, and it does make a big difference. But I would argue that from a timber perspective, the difference is primarily economic. It's back to that concept that it allows us to sustain the woodlands that otherwise would get sold off for housing developments if no one wants to buy the timber.
That's another interesting perspective on that. Yes, yes. If we're looking at some of the other questions, actually, just another good question has come in relating to a topic that always comes up in bio about whether by harvesting the plant biomass might be sort of depleting the ecosystem, and in particular the soil stocks. And I guess something you probably just didn't have time to refer to specifically was the fact that, in fact, many of these processes, like the residues from anaerobic digestion, can generate waste that can then be returned to the land, can't they?
You're right. There's three macronutrients we're interested in: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium are the main ones. Nitrogen is not significant for most trees. But by removing the timber, the nitrogen content is so small, it really doesn't make a difference. You can get to the stage over, let's say, a 10-year period where you might get a deficiency in potassium or phosphate. And you deal with that by, yes, monitoring the soil and putting small applications on. And that was the graph that I showed right at the start, where I looked at the GWP with synthetic fertilizer and with sewage sludge. So what we were doing there was we had calculated what needed to be replaced by what we were removing.
Yes, yes. Yes.
And the carbon content of the soil isn't an issue because you have such large amounts of leaf litter dropping. That returns a massive amount of carbon to the soil. You get a humus layer across the top, which is very carbon rich and organic material. So that one isn't an issue, but the content, the nutrient content is an absolutely valid point, but the quantity of fertilizer that you need to replace it is really low. I can see the next one on biodiversity. Yeah, so if you look at the comic book, you will see when we talk about that land use change impact, that's one of the key factors there. So what you find is if you're going for things like willow plantations, you get increases in small invertebrates, you get increases in songbirds, that sort of thing. And there are other things that you get decreases in. So it's back to the swings and roundabout argument. On the whole, willow coppice and miscanthus is more ecodiverse than most cropland. So it depends on what you're displacing. They're better than grassland as well, but obviously not as good as, you know, a natural woodland. Nick, UK electricity being decarbonised quickly. Yeah, you did right. Yeah, so this is one of the things that is pushing the argument, which I didn't cover at all, towards biomass to energy with carbon capture and storage. The reality of the world that we live in is that we've bought into a net zero by 2050 argument that actually cannot be met by reducing our emissions. We have to extract CO2 from atmosphere. Now, one of the things about biomass is it provides a really nifty natural solution that, you know, the trees are there, they're doing it, and we don't need to design it, we don't need to build it. It's taking the CO2 from atmosphere, and what we then need to do is lock that up. So I actually have been working for a number of years on project concepts around taking the biomass and not.
Sorry,
not
I can't hear you.
it.
I've got this other presentation going. Let me just call you on my other phone.
Okay, so project concepts where we don't burn, but we turn this into a mix of gases, and we then actually take the CO2 and we sequester it, and we use it for other things. So CO2 recycling and CO2 utilization for a range of chemical products. So the best use of biomass, according to the CCC, is to do that, to have biomass to energy with carbon capture and storage. I argue that the best use of biomass depends on what you mean by best, which depends on whether you're trying to achieve carbon reductions or biodiversity or jobs or whatever.
And then, of course, I suppose one could add to that something that I know a lot of your colleagues are working on, which is possible routes to using the carbon as a feedstock for, you know, other biorefinery applications or to
Absolutely.
derive higher value products.
So I've got a colleague in Aston who's working with another South African group on cassava, which is a staple crop for many low-income communities and indeed middle-income communities in that country. And the cassava has substantial residues, which still have quite a lot of starch in them. He's working on production of PAHs for polymers from the cassava. I have another colleague who's been working on wood residues and is pyrolysing those to produce a substitute for bitumen for road building. So those are the sort of applications where you can actually lock things up, where you're producing, heavy duty material.
Yes.
So Amanda, what was the previous question from Amanda? Because I'm trying to see what the sugar cane and rice is a reference to. Was that about nutrients?
I think it may have been. Yes, I just back at that thread.
So on the sugarcane and rice, on the rice straw front, there's not an issue. Normally the rice straw, despite best efforts of legislation, the vast majority of rice straw in the world actually gets burnt. So there are very long-term trials have been done actually out in the International Rice Research Institute, whom we work with in the Philippines, that have shown that because you're dealing with waterlogged paddy fields, the soil carbon content does not deteriorate even over a 40-year period if you don't return the straw. So there isn't an issue with the carbon content for the rice. With the sugarcane, it's the same argument as I gave for the trees, in that you still have leaf litter drop from the sugarcane, which will decompose. It's just the bagasse, so that's the hard stem that surrounds the sugar that we're proposing to use. And someone's done my job and given a link for the comic. Excellent. The comic is really good. It's pretty old now, but it's an excellent read.
Yes, in fact, those examples you were just discussing might be regarded as examples of, in a sense, well-managed agricultural landscapes. And I suppose there's a big ecological dimension as well that's of interest to many people at the moment about ecological restoration and trying to, capitalize on the enthusiasm for free planting schemes or natural regeneration of forests, and perhaps even being able to restore partially degraded lands to
absolutely
cover. So
and one of the things I think that we're seeing happening now with, now that we have Brexited and we are post-CAP, we've seen DEFRA taking a much closer look at ecosystem evaluation and trying to get rid of the single farm payment scheme and instead to reward people, landowners, for what they're doing in terms of the ecosystem. So this is quite key, and one of the best adverts I've ever seen for planting bioenergy crops was up in the northwest. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there were some massive floods up in Cumbria, and there was an entire railway line got washed away. So there are one or two people I work with up there who plant bioenergy around the region. They send it into Igesund, which is a paper mill with its own power plant, and the bioenergy gets used in the power plant. Now, Neil had been growing willow with various farmers around the county, and what they found was that when the floods came, the willow has a much higher roughness index, so it interrupted the flow. It is incredibly hygroscopic, so it absolutely sucks up the water when you get those big influxes, that come all at once in terms of a flood. And we got some lovely photos afterwards of the totally devastated flooded fields, but then the willow field next to it, and behind that fields with sheep that were merrily grazing because the land there had been protected from the sudden flood. And, the fact that entire timber sleepers from the railway line had been stopped by the willow that was growing in between. So what's normally recommended, therefore, is to have this patchwork of planting where you've got, the sheep in one field, the willow in the next field, and other things in other ones. So not to have a big monoscape, but to have variety.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, many journalists are writing about the Cumbrian landscape at the moment, aren't they? That's a very good example.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've got any other questions coming into the room, but you've given us a wonderful overview of many different topics. Oh, one more has just come in.
Yeah, I mean, I love what I do because of the variety. I've been working on this space for 20 years and, you know, you could never describe it as boring. We deal with the social, economic, environmental, so many different crops, different parts of the world. It's an incredible, I'm incredibly lucky to do what I do.
Yeah, I think one.
Oh my goodness.
Indirect land use change. Yeah.
Yeah. So indirect land use change is because you take a hectare of land that's, let's say, growing wheat, and you say, no, we're not going to grow wheat there. We're going to grow a crop that we'll use for energy. So that means that we need to assume that someone somewhere still wants the grain and still wants the wheat. And therefore, you will have had a carbon change on the land you're looking at, but there's also a change happening on somewhere else. It's a bit like the argument I made that the temporal carbon debt thing is about only looking at part of the picture. The same is true here. If we only look at the field where we're growing, we're missing the bigger picture. And what you see then happening is, if you've pushed that onto another piece of land, it's not necessarily the case that you need the same area of land. You might need more because it might be a lower grade land, and therefore the land area that you're actually changing via this indirect impact can be larger. What has been done is the European Commission's Joint Research Centre have calculated ILUC factors for different existing land uses and different parts of the world. And the common practice in the methodologies that are applied is that you simply apply an ILUC factor and you say, right, well, I've got a carbon impact of this because I've changed 1 hectare, but I need to multiply it by 1.5 because it's in this part of the world and it used to produce this. And that's how it's calculated. But it's about looking at satellite imaging and looking at the GIS data that we have through about the reality of what's happening in parts of the world where those impacts are actually taking place. Because I have not a lot of confidence that what we're seeing is the reality. And like I said, we're increasingly seeing individual studies coming through saying, well, we looked at it in the northern US and we didn't see it happening. And we looked at it here and we didn't see it. But, you know, those are bits of a jigsaw. As long as you've left a gap in between, you've got that uncertainty that you don't know what's happening there. So I would love to see a nice comprehensive study of satellite data homing in on the areas where we know there has been bioenergy planting and trying to establish statistically what we see happening in terms of land use change around an entire region as a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
You're dead right on the willow. And willow, when you do willow, you do take the whole tree. So willow is a short rotation crop that you take in and you literally, I didn't put any photos in. I could have put in photos of the chip harvesters that just run through the field, chip it automatically, take it straight in. It's the forestry stuff and the residues that the timber argument runs for.
Mm-hmm.
Just reading this one. I think you can see from the figures I showed you for the UK at the start that there is more than enough waste and residues in the UK for us to significantly increase bio without going near any direct crops. The direct crops, I would say, would mainly be justified on an ecosystem benefit and a rural social impact basis. Can we protect forests from the increase in... Well, one very good way of doing it is to manage them properly. So, you know, the practice of going in and thinning and creating fire breaks, as they do, you know, throughout the US, actually reduces the propensity to fire risks. And one of the countries where this is really key is actually in Spain, where they've done a lot of work on intensifying the management of forests in order to prevent forest fires, because, of course, the climate impact of that is so much worse than the climate impact of any other systems that we have. Okay, I think, have we exhausted the questions? It's great.
We have just about, there may be 1 or 2 more. We've just got a couple more minutes left.
Oh, decomposing wood chips. Okay, I have nice graphs on this, actually, if you want to drop me an email. So one of the things we looked at a few years ago was whether it's common practice, particularly in the US, to chop the trees, to take the residues and leave the residues in a pile at the side of the landing site, and let those just sit there to dry. Because when they're cut, wood is about 50% moisture, and you can get it down to 30% by just leaving it there for 2-3 months. So one of the things we got a bit worried about was whether that was actually the decomposition might have been releasing methane. So we did some modelling. I can send you a link to the paper that looked at the only assumptions we could find on how much methane does a pile of wood chips produce under different conditions. And we thought, oh my goodness, because I have charts that will show you that with 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, by the time you get to 4 months of sitting there, it's worse than coal. This would be a disaster if it were true. And herein is the problem with models and assumptions. So what we then did was we got one of the agricultural institutes in the UK to actually build a real pile and to have a real look and measure the methane. And what they discovered was that the actual methane that was effluxing from the wood pile was nowhere near as high as the previous assumptions had been, and that therefore we actually don't have a problem. So I could send you a link to the paper we wrote, which says, hey, we've got a big problem, just as you put there. But since then, we've actually proved that it's not that big a problem after all.
Yes,
the importance of knowledge and research and going round.
Good. And maybe we'll just take one more question. Patricia, if you're still with us, I think there was a brief interruption there. Can you see that last question that's just come in?
Could you repeat what the benefits and caveats
Could you repeat the benefits, caveats of the if land is used for energy crops instead of food, please?
Okay, I'll maybe go back to the slide, actually. It should be easier. Because I had one on this. It's quite a long way up.
I guess you're arguing, aren't you, that or recognizing that it's obviously of high priority to leave good quality land available for food production, seeing as we're going to need to almost double global food production in the next 30 years.
Indeed, although I think that we possibly, I've done a lot of work in the past as well on future food provision and sustainable intensification and dietary change. I think that what you find is that a lot of the drivers for arable land use are actually around meat. And with, you know, expanding populations that are affluent in China, South America, elsewhere, you do get a lot of pressure on the land. There has been some work done by a group in the Netherlands which showed that actually if we all ate nutritious diets and we got rid of the 50% or so of food that we actually waste all the way through the supply chain, that we could have huge benefits here. So while I buy that with an increasing population, we will need more food, I think we actually, as a society, should be seriously thinking about what we eat, how much we eat, and how much we waste. So I don't buy the argument that we need to double our production. There has been quite a lot of work done with a model. I'll just type the name of it into the chat, called the GloBiome model. A guy called Hugo Valance in the Netherlands did this, and he looks at the problem you describe, where different different global land use scenarios for feeding the population and looking at bio, and the two can coexist. I think, you know, I always come back to the fact that we need different bits of solutions in different parts of the world depending on the demand. I don't think, you know, one of the things I always think in the UK is that we have the highest wheat yields in the world, but we don't produce anywhere near as much as we could do because we want forests and other things. So it's, you know, it swings and roundabouts. Different countries may want to step up to this challenge. We have to see. Less supported than solar wind? I don't think that's true, actually. The UK Climate Assembly, I spoke to them on their last weekend before they went into lockdown in March last year. And roughly a third say that they like the idea of bio, and roughly a third say that they're not sure because of all these complex issues we've just been talking about. So I don't think it's less than solar or wind. There's also some work done by the ETI on that a few years ago. But I do think that we need to improve the public understanding. And I especially, you know, when I look at programs like, you know, David Attenborough on the telly, and he does a great job on animals and things, and I just think someone needs to do this for forests. The UK public need to understand what a forest is, what the difference is between, you know, natural primeval forests and plantation forests, and how this works, because people just don't get it. People think cutting down trees, that's awful. Not true. You know, it's part of a natural cycle. So yeah, I think there's a huge public communications thing, and I come full circle and I say, please read the comic because it does a good job on it.
That's great. Well, thank you, Patricia. We've pretty much used up our hour and we've had a very full discussion. Can I thank you on behalf of the entire audience for an absolutely fascinating overview of the topic? You packed a huge amount into your presentation and also sparked off a range of very interesting questions, I think. So we're very grateful to you for giving up your time to talk to us in this way and add to our Energy Network series.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk to you all, and hopefully we can follow it up at some point with
there may be specific questions, which
specific
I guess
questions, or you know, around your own group, and who knows, maybe we'll come down for real at some point.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Okay, thank you.